Recognize the Honourable Member for St. James North.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to support this resolution for $175,000 to be given to the Ann Hill School. I know the area very well, sir, having gone to school at New Pine Primary, as it was then called, now called Wilkie Comerbatch, in the same compound. And my sister, having gone to school at the now Irving Wilson School, then the School for the Deaf, also in the same compound, sir. So I speak with first-hand knowledge of the area, and any monies given to improve the infrastructure of any school which caters to children with disabilities in this country is well spent, sir. We have to look at the history, sir, of education for children with disabilities. I would start in 2000, when this Parliament, under the last Barbados Labour Party administration, would have brought a green paper and then a white paper in May and August 2000, respectively, with one of the core policy objectives being the provision of access to education for all children with disabilities at all educational levels in an integrated setting wherever possible, with specialized facilities for those needing such facilities. So as has been said before, and as it is worth repeating, sir, the question is permitting, as reasonably as possible in all the circumstances, children with disabilities, differently abled children, sir, to fulfill their maximum potential as any other child, as any other, in fact, individual in Barbados must be allowed to fulfill their potential, sir. There can't be any question of anyone being left behind, sir. It has not always been the case, as the Honourable Member for St. Thomas spoke about, where children with disabilities have been allowed to flourish, sir. We all remember the days a few decades ago where they were hidden in houses, not educated, not allowed to develop, sir. Thankfully, those days are gone, but we still haven't come to the place where we ought to be in terms of Barbados being geared towards the maximum potential of children with disabilities being realized. The Honourable Member for St. Michael South East, who has led this debate, spoke about her ministry and she personally working towards a special needs policy, and I look forward to that policy being brought to Cabinet. As the Honourable Member said, in the next few months, and then to this Parliament. We've been fooling around with this for too long, sir. As she has said, that such a paper has been stuck in draft form in the Ministry of Education for years now. That policy needs to be developed and to be brought into the force of law in this country, sir. In addition to that, of course, the Education Act, which I know my honourable colleague minister is looking at, needs to be, in terms of reform and modernisation. And whenever that is done, sir, I look forward to debating on the issue of creating a right, sir, legislative right, as there is not now, for children with disabilities to receive the same education as children without disabilities. Because a lot of people in Barbados do not realize that children with disabilities effectively do not have the right to quality education, to free education, as other children, because practically a lot of children with disabilities have to pay to go to special schools. Thankfully, some of the international charities and foundations that are here, that were spoken of by the Honourable Minister Member of Parliament for the city, thankfully some of these foundations and charitable organizations, the Maria Holder Trust, Derek Smith Trust, Sandy Lane Trust, help fund these schools, such as the school in Perry, Gap-Off, Robert Street. Of course, Derek Smith has his own multi-million-dollar school, $20 million in layers. Some of us were at that opening a few years ago. Thankfully, they have come to the rescue and they fund the education of children with disabilities whose parents would otherwise not have been able to afford such education. But the reality is that our Education Act speaks about free education, primary and secondary level, from age 4 to 16 for children. And practically, a lot of children with disabilities are not within that zone. So we have a urgent need to revise the Education Act when that is done to include this right for all, sir, because a society has to be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable, as Mahatma Gandhi said. And unless we bring all into the web, as we, this political party charged as it is by the people of Barbados, to move us into the third decade of the 21st century as, again, the leading small island developing state in the world, we cannot afford to leave behind children or indeed people with disabilities. People with disabilities, as the Poverty Condition Fund study into poverty conditions, which I know the Honourable member for St. Michael South Central would have first-hand knowledge of. It was funded by the Caribbean Development Bank in 2010 study, spoke about where it said that at that time 20% of people in Barbados were living below poverty line. And out of those 20%, 20% of those persons were persons with disabilities. Now, persons with disabilities are said only to make up 5% of the people of Barbados. And therefore, at 20% of 20%, sir, people with disabilities were, in fact, 4 times below the poverty line in terms of category of persons than the average in Barbados. And this is not something that we ought to be proud of. I know that a census, I believe, will be due next year. Census is due every 10 years, and we will look to see if there has been much change in that. But we have the duty as a government, as a state, to improve on these figures. Certainly, training of teachers in special needs has to be a priority of the Ministry of Education. I know they're working on that, giving more people, more teachers, the incentives and the funding, the scholarships to go and train in special needs, because this is something that has to be done on a continuous basis. We have to look, sir, at buses for children with disabilities, differently abled children, to get to school, because it is okay to say that you're providing accommodation for them, to retrofitting accommodation, and in terms of the ramps and giving the technology, the braille and the communication devices and the integrated systems at the school for them to learn, but is also another thing to be able to transport them to the school, something that is a problem in Barbados. When this political party was last in office, they had 5 buses, sir, owned by the Transport Board under the last for children with disabilities, retrofitted to that effect. That went down to 1 under the last government, sir. They failed then to repair those buses when they needed repairs. But that was the legacy that the last government has left this country, unfortunately, sir. Barbados is, of course, a party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, having signed that convention on the 19th of July 2007, a convention that came into force by ratification of the determined number of countries in May 2008, and then was in fact ratified by the then government of Barbados on the 27th of September 2013. So the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, United Nations Convention, even though not passed into law in Barbados, has mandated Barbados at international level to observe certain norms and to observe the terms of that treaty. And of course, that treaty speaks about inclusive education, sir, because this is what has been determined is best for children with disabilities. Inclusive education at all levels, directed to the full development of the human potential and the sense of dignity and self-worth of children with disabilities, and the strengthening of respect for their human rights, their fundamental freedoms, and their human diversity. Essentially, sir, it speaks towards allowing children with disabilities, in fact, persons with disabilities, to participate fully and effectively in a free society, to be able to become active members of a community, sir, as any individual has that right to be, to become independent and worthy citizens in the national development of this country. Because there are persons with disabilities, a lot of them, sir, and we all know, have as much, in fact, more intelligence than many people without disabilities. It may be that they're blind, sir, but nothing is wrong with their brain. Maybe that they're deaf, sir. We have examples in Barbados, not only in Barbados, but throughout the world, sir. Children with disabilities, young adults going to University of the West Indies and doing well, some even getting first-class honors, sir, at law school. No, they have the right to full potential, sir, and I would like to see a situation, in fact, where the Ministry of Education can specially fund these children. In fact, when the last government, sir, totally in their lack of wisdom and their malice, removed state-funded education for tuition fees for Barbadians at the University of the West Indies, I called on the then government to exempt persons with disabilities from that, continue to pay for them at university. They of course ignored me. So the Honourable Minister of Education and this government, in its wisdom, a year ago restored state-funded tuition fees at University of the West Indies, so children, young adults with disabilities can again access universities. But we have to do more, sir. We have to give them greater chances and opportunities to continue as the convention, the United Nations Convention, speaks towards access of tertiary education, towards greater access to vocational training, towards greater access to adult education and to lifelong learning, sir. As the Honourable Member for St. Peter just spoke about, towards life skills, sir, on an equal basis with others, towards their reasonable accommodation. So all of this is part of what makes a country great, as we aim for Barbados to be again. Sir, we need, of course, to look as a government to create the environment, the policies, the laws to speak towards this fundamental issue, sir. And this government has been doing that. You will recall that we brought, sir, and I brought in December, the amendment to the Immigration Act, which removed the Victorian legacy of this country, the highly discriminatory clause under which an immigration officer could prohibit a person who was, quote-unquote, an imbecile, sir. Now, I don't know what that is, sir, because that had some in here on the government side in the last parliament, the truth. I don't know what an imbecile is, sir. How, because someone has a disability, they're suddenly an imbecile. And it also said people who are visually blind, sir, that an immigration officer could have prevented them on whatever discriminatory basis coming into Barbados. So we removed that clause, sir. Totally offensive. Idiots, feeble-minded, all of that had, sir. And it took this government, led by this Honourable Prime Minister, sir, to bring to Parliament the removal of that Victorian clause, sir. we, sir, have brought as a policy the reality of 1% of persons with disabilities getting government procurement and contracts, sir. Cabinet of Barbados and this Parliament subsequently have agreed as a matter of policy to that 1% of all government contracts and procurement opportunities will go to people with disabilities, sir. A fantastic initiative, sir. The challenge now is, of course, to put people with disabilities in a position where they can access and take advantage of that cabinet policy, sir, because it's all right for a government to pass policies, pass legislation, but the implementation. And I look forward, sir, and I've spoken, sir, with the stakeholders on persons with disabilities, and of course, sir, even though in my position as a cabinet minister, I'm no longer now able to serve directly as directors of the councils for disabled and the associations that I used to, and be their legal advisor, sir, voluntarily as I used to be. I still keep in touch, sir, and I certainly urge them to be in a position and urge those policy makers and advisors in government to put people with disabilities in a position where they can take advantage of this tremendous initiative by this government, sir. I know, sir, of course, that the Cabinet of Barbados last year also agreed to continue the policy making of the Employment Prevention of Discrimination Bill, sir, which has been around for a while, since 2015. Of course, the last government doing nothing about seeking to bring it to this Parliament to make it the law of Barbados, sir. And the Honourable Member for St. Peter, who just spoke, his capacity as Minister of Labour, we spoke about it yesterday, sir, actively looking to get that bill fast-tracked to be brought back to Cabinet and back in, and into this House of Assembly, sir, because that bill will legislatively prevent the discrimination of persons with disabilities in the workforce, both within the public sector and the private sector of Barbados, is something that is absolutely necessary, something that, again, it would be in fulfillment of our international commitments as a signatory to the United Nations Convention on Persons with Disabilities, sir. This is totally essential, sir, because persons with disabilities have to have as equal an opportunity in this country to be able to work in areas that they can work, sir. I mean, there are countries such as Jamaica that even before they had disabilities legislation had a quota for reservation of 3% of government jobs for persons with disabilities. So I'm an advocate for that kind of affirmative action policy to help people with disabilities, sir. We have to do it. This government has been doing its best. I look forward to the day when I will be contributing to a debate on disabilities legislation in this Parliament. And I know that the Honourable Member for St. Thomas, sir, one of the most caring politicians ever to step into this Parliament, that she will ensure that her ministry works towards that, sir, because, of course, I would have brought a private member's bill in March 2015 calling for that, sir. And again, we are committed at international level as a signatory to the United Nations Convention to bring about that legislative intervention in this Parliament of Barbados, sir. Sir, the Honourable Minister of Education knows she has my full support when it comes to education for persons with disabilities, sir, because education is the key by which most vulnerable people who have been born in a socially advantageous position, people who, because of the circumstances of life, need government intervention to assist them to the next level, sir, need the support of the state. And, sir, I am happy to be party to a Parliament that brings this resolution to this House, sir, and in any way looks to financially assist the improvement and the amelioration of life for children with disabilities and for persons with disabilities in general. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I recognize the Honourable Member for St. Michael South.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman,